Good afternoon, everybody. Doing a presentation after listening to Dr. Kamal Tube becomes a bit of a challenge, but I'll try. The topic that we are going to discuss is about privatization. And I'm sure all of us have been reading in the papers, something in social media around privatization. And I'm sure a number of us have been asking questions, what is this thing called privatization? This is a topic that you can discuss for a whole week, but I've been given 30 minutes to be able to just present something, and then we'll be able to engage. So I think it's important, before we look at the topic, to be able to appreciate a few terminologies, because then we'll be able to work together. So when you talk about privatization, what do you exactly mean? And it's defined in our Privatisation Act 2023 as a transaction that results in a transfer other than to a public entity. Maybe before I finish that definition, so when there is a transfer from one public entity to another, that is not a privatization. It's very important for us to appreciate that particular point so that then we can be able to work together. And the transfer involves assets or liabilities for a public entity, including shares in a public entity. So this is a transaction that moves assets from public hands into private. And if we can be able then to appreciate that, then we can be able to work together. Something else that you will hear as we move forward is something called a privatization program. So what's a privatization program? We say it's a list of public entities that have been identified through public participation. So if you get an opportunity to be able to read our Privatisation Act 2023, you'll be able to appreciate the process for which we identify entities for privatization. It must involve public participation. So your input is very important and critical. Approved for privatization by the Cabinet, the National Assembly, and gazetted. Very important. So it starts with us to identify. Once we've identified, then the Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury will then present this list that you identified to Cabinet for approval, and subsequently it will then be taken to the National Assembly for ratification. And once that has happened, then it must be gazetted. It is at that particular point after gazettement that the Privatization Authority comes in to do the implementation. So our role as the Privatization Authority is to implement that which the public has approved for implementation and gazetted. You will hear about public entity. Again, it's good for us to appreciate. When we talk about a public entity, what are we saying? It says a public entity is a national government-linked corporation. Now, terminology. When we talk about government-linked, we are basically saying it is that corporation where government is a minority. So we call it government-linked. A subsidiary of a national government corporation, we have instances where certain state corporations have established subsidiaries, and those subsidiaries carry out commercial activity. That is part of what is included in a public entity. And then a state corporation within the meaning of the State Corporations Act. So this is where government owns more than 50% shareholding. And therefore, anytime we talk about privatization, from the context of the Privatisation Act 2023, we are looking at privatizations that involve transfer of assets and shares that are within either national government-linked corporation, a subsidiary, or a state corporation. That is very important for us to appreciate from the start. Now, it's important again for us to look at the journey. to have the appreciation of what is this thing we call privatization. Is it something that started yesterday? The answer is no. Privatization started in 1992 without a policy or legal framework. So this is where then some entities were identified as carrying out commercial activities, and government then felt that we didn't need to continue running these activities, and therefore we need to privatize. However, as a result of structural reforms that were spearheaded by IMF and World Bank, then the government of Kenya, through the Ministry of Finance, was able to issue some policy that guided the public enterprise reform and privatization with certain key objectives, which one of them was to enhance the role of the private sector in the economy. There was that feeling that we may have established certain commercial enterprises at a certain point in time because of certain purposes. But then the question was, should government continue carrying out commercial activities, even in areas where private sector are better placed? Those were the questions. To reduce the demand of state-owned enterprises on the exchequer so as to optimize the limited resources. We'll be getting some examples because we live in this country, and we'll be able to look at some of the commercial entities that we know. They are supposed to be earning government taxes and also paying dividends. But certainly, we'll be able to look at, and all of us may be aware of, some where the expectation is that we get revenue from them, but they are also queuing with other state departments that are involved in providing essential services also to be funded. Does it make sense? Maybe we need to look at reducing the role of government in state-owned enterprises. One of the critical aspects that need to be taken into consideration. Broadening the base of ownership and enhancing capital markets. For example, one of the methods of privatization is IPOs, initial public offer. And most of us are aware about the Safaricom, we are aware about Kengen, we are out of, I think there was KQ. In this, it gave an opportunity to Wanjiko and people down there to also feel we own a piece of something. And therefore, when we carry out privatization, and especially through IPO, then we grant Kenyans an opportunity to be able to own something. And this is where we talk about broadening the base of ownership. And by doing IPOs, then we are also facilitating processes within the NSC, and therefore we deepen capital markets. It's so very important for us to appreciate. So that privatization is not just an end in itself, but there are so many other things that work together to bring benefits. And that is very important for us to do the appreciation. During that period also, then there was the need to have an institutional arrangement on what do we need to do. So then the government established a parastatal reform program committee, which was chaired then by the Vice President and Minister for Finance. What was the responsibility of this committee? The responsibility was to provide policy and direction. It also established what you call Executive Secretariat and Technical Unit, which was the watu wa mkono of the BRPC doing the implementation. Both of these committees were tasked with implementing the privatization program. So I defined what a privatization program is. So they identified some entities. And during that time, there were 240 commercially oriented SOEs with direct and indirect government holdings. Out of the 240, 33 of them were considered strategic, and government would retain them for purpose of retaining ownership and active participation. Now, the remaining 207, by extension, meant these were candidates for privatization, and therefore needed to go through the program as guided by the Parastatal Reform Program Committee and executed by the Executive Secretariat and Technical Unit. What were the functions of the Parastatal Reform Committee? To supervise and coordinate the implementation, prioritize and determine timing of the sale of this. Let me not read, but it was basically providing policy. But more importantly, look at the last one. It was to provide political impetus for privatization. As most of us may have read, and it's a very common thing, is that privatization is a commercial activity, but at the same time, a political activity. Politics and privatization zinaendanga hivi. And I'm sure you must have heard pronouncements on issues around privatization. Mali yetu inaenda, this and the other, this belongs to our ancestors, among so many others. The ESTU, as I said earlier, was tasked with the responsibility of implementation of what had been identified for privatization. Now, during that particular period, we didn't have any legal framework to guide privatizations. We started without any, then we came up with a policy that guided, came up with PPRC and also ESTU. But then there were issues that were raised. And the feeling was, for us to see transparency in this particular process, we needed to come up with some legal framework. And therefore, in 2005, the Privatization Act was enacted. Why? Because there was perception that the privatization program was surrounded in mystery and corruption. When you listen to some people, they say, during those days, we used to see this, which used to be government, it's no longer. How it happened, we don't know. Those were the issues. There was a feeling that there was stakeholder interference, and therefore needed a legal framework that will guide how that process is, so that then certain powers are given to implementing authorities, or even those who involved in policy. During that particular period also, there were issues raised around governance. And it's during this period that we had an act government. And one of their campaign issues was that we needed to put in place a transparent process for conducting privatizations. And therefore, then felt that there was a need to come up with an act and establish an institution that would be a body corporate for purpose of carrying out privatizations. And that act brought into being what we call then the Privatization Commission, which was the successor to the ESTU, which was the implementing arm, and it was established under Section 3 of that Privatization Act of 2005. Come January 2008, that is when the Privatization Commission commenced its work under legal notice number 397 of the 4th of December 2007. The mandate being to formulate, manage, and implement. When you talk about formulation, this is where you identify. Talk about manage, the process once it's been gazetted for implementation. And then the implementation is where you carry out the actual element of what privatization entails. And I wish we had more time, I would be able to take you through. And there's something called making and implementing specific proposals for privatization in accordance. After you've done what we call due diligence, it's a requirement of the law that you prepare something we call a privatization proposal. Now, somebody can ask, what is this thing called a privatization proposal? What we do is, when you do due diligence, you do the financial health check of the entity that you want to privatize. You carry out legal due diligence. Why? You want to see whether there are any legal impediments that can affect the privatization process and find a way of mitigating or addressing it. If it's a manufacturing company, you need to look at the technical aspects. You need to do asset valuation. And eventually, you will do a business valuation, which will guide how you're going to value that particular asset and share within that. So once you've done all that, then that due diligence presents to you what best method of privatization it is. And therefore, when you're preparing that proposal, you will indicate this particular state corporation was created or established to achieve this particular purpose. Does it still achieve the same? Is it still necessary for government to continue with it? Do we have private sector having matured to be able to do that, is it still necessary? All those issues will be captured after you've done the due diligence, and that is presented to Cabinet for approval. Then subsequently, it is implemented. After some time, 2005, this was before the 2010 Constitution. So many things changed. What was happening then, policy and implementation was being done by one institution. Then there was a need to do a review of the Privatisation Act 2005, and last year, October, is when we had the Privatisation Act of 2023 coming into being, bringing forth the Privatisation Authority, now changed from commission to authority, under Section 8 of that Act, and this time around, it's very specific, implement the privatization program. So the aspect of formulation disappeared, because then that was policy, and it also required that in terms of the formulation, you must participate in the identification. And therefore, recognition of that, that is public participation, that element was, so we are left with the responsibility of what you have identified. Our responsibility is to implement. We talk about the same proposal we talk about. We are also tasked with the responsibility of advising government on all aspects of privatization of public entities, and also facilitating implementation of such. What was the Commission tasked to do? There was what we call an inaugural privatization program, which was approved by Cabinet in 2008 and gazetted on 14th of August 2009, which comprised of 26 public entities. I'm sure you must have seen this. If you went to the website of the Privatization Authority or Commission, then you would see these Kenya Wine agencies, which were done partially. And every time I meet a lot of people, they ask me, how long have you been in the Commission? What have you done since then? We're only aware of Kenya Wine agencies, which was a partial privatization. So we had Kenya Wine agencies, Agrochemical and Food Company, Development Bank of Kenya, Consolidated Bank. There's what we are calling KDC associated companies. So when you see International Hotels Kenya Limited, this is what we famously call Hilton. Kenya Hotel Properties Limited, this is what we famously call Intercontinental. Mountain Lodge is somewhere in Central, and the Arc Limited. So this is what we are calling associated, where government owns a minority shareholding. Then we have Kenya Safari Lodges and Hotels. This one covers Mombasa Beach. We have Ngulia and Voi Safari Lodges, Sunset Hotel in Kisumu, Cove Hotel in Kakamega, Mount Elgon Hotel in Trans Nzoia, and Kabarnet Hotel in Baringo. Then we had Kenya Meat Commission. There was National Bank of Kenya. Then we have the sugar companies as listed. There was an element also of Kenya Ports Authority, the Eldoret Inland Container Terminal, outsourcing of steering services, and development of parts were part of what was in that list. We had East African Portland Cement, New Kenya KCC, Numerical Machining Complex, IPS, Kengen, and Kenya Pipeline. So those were entities that were initially listed in the inaugural privatization program. Most of us remember the Abdikadir task force that looked at rationalization of state corporations. In July of 2014, we were directed to hold in abeyance all privatizations pending the outcome of that task force, because it was looking at the totality in terms of rationalization of state enterprises. And when eventually they came up with their report, on the 29th of March of 2019, that's after 55 months, that is when they looked at that and said, based on what they have assessed, then number 18, 19, 20, 21 up to 26 were not supposed to be continued with privatization. And therefore, we were told, deal with anything else other than those are identified. East African Portland out, New KCC, Numerical Machining, Kengen, and Kenya Pipeline. So we remained with those ones. Do we know the status of these particular companies? I'm sure depending on where we socialize and the places where we are, we can be able to assess the status. Now, the question then that comes in is, what was the intention of government in identifying that inaugural list? And how do you link that to the economic development of a country? And this is from a very narrow sense, because I don't want to get into trouble with Dr. Kamau Tuke when it comes to economics. I only did it as part of... What was the intention? The intention of privatization is you want to reduce demand for government resources. For argument's sake, you've been created as a commercial entity. What is the purpose of a commercial entity? It's supposed to do business, make profits, pay taxes, and pay dividends to shareholders. You will find those established as commercial entities were also queuing for resources. And therefore, the purpose was identify them, let them go to the right place, so that then we reduce demand for government resources so that they can be allocated to other productive sectors in the provision of essential services. By privatizing, you're getting additional revenue for government from the compensation for privatizations. That money can be used for other productive services that go to improve the economy of a country. Improving regulation of the economy. Dr. Kamau Tuge is here, giving examples. Central Bank is a regulator of the banking sector. If one of the children or one of the entities that government runs business is a bank, and that child misbehaves, what does central bank do? If it tries to favor, then it's expected that when the other that is not linked with government misbehaves, then it needs to treat it the same way. So there is need to improve regulation of the economy by reducing conflicts so that government becomes a regulator, and where commercial activity is and we feel it's not necessary, let the private sector do it because they're geared for that purpose. I talked about broadening the base of ownership in the economy, improving the efficiency of the Kenyan economy by making it more responsive to market forces. That normally happens. Enhance and develop capital markets. We already discussed where we are talking about IPOs. Encourage more participation of the private sector in the economy by shifting the production and delivery. Okay. Why should serikali be making mandasi and tea? Surely? Should we? Improve infrastructure and delivery of public services through improvement of private capital. If you look at sugar companies, for example, those of us who come from that region, I was educated through proceeds from sale of sugarcane. My father was and still remains a farmer. We supplied sugarcane to Chemelil. And there were instances where it took 2 years to be paid for supplies. There are private companies that are mushroomed. They come from several kilometers, come and station collection points, and they pay farmers within 2 weeks, 1 month. What is the motivation to take to a publicly owned mill? The question is, why must we be doing crushing of sugar to get sugar? Why? So these are the issues that we need to confront. So that even as we discuss and debate this issue around privatization, what we are asking ourselves is it just for the sake of having, or there must be something productive? So that then the limited resources that we have are better utilized. Does it make sense for a company established to carry out commercial activity, also queuing for resources with other essential service providing agencies? Does it make sense? Those are things we need to debate so that the team that is here is really supposed to be agents of educating the masses on whether we really need to continue doing these things, or it's that time we now let go and say, let the private sector do that which they know better. and government does which it is geared to do. However, in the identification, there are very critical issues. We talked about 240 at that time, then we say there were 33. Now those 33 were identified as strategic. What was the issue that was being looked at? Strategic from the sense of national security. So even if it's conducting perhaps a commercial activity and there's an element that touches on national security, then it may make sense for it to be retained and run by government. That which has an element to do with environment and issues related with health, then it becomes necessary that may be considered. If it's not any of those, why? Those are questions we need to. I may not have the answers, but we're dealing with that level within our country that understand and appreciate these issues. And therefore, we need to be agents to see really whether we need to continue with what we do. People have talked about what they think about privatization. And Milton Friedman says, the philosophy behind privatization is the belief in the power of markets to allocate resources and promote economic growth. I think it makes sense. You may have a different view, but I think what you are saying makes sense. Tony Blair said, privatization can unlock dormant assets, creating a more productive and dynamic economy. I also think so. You may have a different opinion, but we need to convince each other, because that conversation is very important. Why we need to continue holding on, even those things that don't work. Friedrich Hayek says, privatization is a means to reduce government interference in the economy, allowing individuals to make more choices and enjoy greater prosperity. It's not privatization authority saying this, somebody is saying it. I think it's for us to have a conversation. Privatization aims to create competition, lower costs, and increase efficiency by injecting market forces into traditionally government-owned industries. Let us stop kutengeneza mandazi. Let us release hotels, let it be done by private sector, they know it better. Privatization aims, so this is John Major. Privatization is not a personal vendetta against the public sector, but a way to unleash innovation and efficiency in service delivery. Now, what say you? This is something I want us to have personal conversations. We have meetings with ourselves, and we ask ourselves, we need to be very honest with our intellectual capacity to be able then to say, does this thing make sense? And we become very honest. And once that happens, then we'll have a conversation that really tries to guide us in terms of saying, do we really need to continue doing this, or we let private sector do it? We've said all this. What have we done? What have we not done? There are few operational challenges that we've experienced. There are multiple stakeholders with varied interests. Every time an entity is identified for privatization, the first thing that comes in is, I am an employee. What will happen once privatization takes place? This company is located in my constituency. I probably may have been 1, 2, 3. When it goes, what will happen? There are many parties. If you look at the process, there are so many people involved. This one has 8 operational challenges, or great operational challenges. Delays in submission of required data. You identify a company for privatization, and because of that fear of the unknown, people are not releasing what you require because they want to delay the process as long as it can take. We have litigations. Some of us may have seen that of late we become active. We've made advertisements for some expressions of interest, but as we speak today, somebody has taken us to court wanting to stop the entire process. It's yet to be determined. So this has become part and parcel of our life in the last several years. The national government and county government transition issues. County government will say, this company that you've identified for privatization is domiciled in my county. Does it belong to me or national government? Those issues come in and it creates problems. The perception that privatization about loss-making companies. Now this one is an even bigger dilemma. When you meet somebody and you say, we're identifying this one, they tell you it's making profits. So deal with the ones that make losses. When you deal with the ones making losses, they tell you it is good to fatten a cow before sell, it only makes sense. Those are arguments. But then we are not asking, how did it become thin in the first place? And was it profitable, like the one we are saying it should not be touched at some point in time? Then what happened? We need to have those conversations. Suspicions and fear of the unknown. Again, the coming in of the Privatisation Act of 2005, at that time we said there was some mischief that was perceived among others. So there are suspicions. Others even say it is like you've already identified somebody, you're just merely doing the process. But if you read the Privatisation Act of 2023 and look at the process, it is so elaborate that by the time you do that, you must be a genius. The feeling of entitlement. People tell you, this land where these companies belong to our ancestors, and therefore it should not be touched. Those are the things that we see. Government policy reviews. When, for example, the Abdikadir task force was conducting its work, for a whole 55 months, from 2014 to 2019, there was no activity because we had a directive all in abeyance. And there are also other governance challenges that come about. And so when a government comes in, looks at certain aspects and says, we have this program which we think can be best delivered using this particular company, and it may fall off the privatization list. Public participation is now becoming an issue. The question is, how much is enough, and what is the framework? Maybe those are conversations we need to have. And as a parting shot, Frederick Chilopa said, privatization is a bitter bill, but it's a bill that will cure. And I think I am aligned. The issues, the feelings, the challenges we have about privatization is, it's actually a bill. I also think it cures. But I'm also not saying that privatization is a panacea to everything. There are issues that come about that are beyond the normal ordinary process. And therefore, they may not all be able to succeed as it were. But to a very large extent, it makes a very big difference. And we want to give the examples that we know. We have the Safaricoms of this world. Try to imagine if it continued where it used to be. We have the KCBs of this world. We are a number of them, including the Qual that we talked about. From the time we sold a small stake to what it is today, there is a complete transformation. Thank you very much.